October 19th, 1945. 14:30 hours. A fenced yard on the outskirts of a War Department camp in the Arizona desert. The sun pressed down like a hand on the corrugated roofs, turning the air above the packed dirt into a trembling veil. The smell of chain oil and hot metal hung low, dense as the dust. Nakamura Yumi tightened her fingers around the rubber grips of the bicycle's handlebars. The frame was too tall for her, American-sized, painted a dull, chipped blue, and the front wheel still carried a smear of Arizona mud from some boy who had ridden it before the war. A U.S. Army military police sergeant in khaki stood by the gate, Colt 45 on his hip, watching the line of women in faded POW denim jackets. Behind Yumi, someone's repaired freewheel ticked, a nervous insect sound. Beside the barracks, the air compressor coughed and fell silent. The hand pump they had used all morning leaned against the wall, its rubber hose still warm from the friction of 100 strokes. A tin of thick amber chain oil sat open on the workbench, sweating in the heat. "Okay, ladies," the sergeant called, shading his eyes with one hand. His English flattened the word into something casual, as if this were an errand instead of an experiment. "One lap. Stay inside the yard. No tricks." Yumi glanced at the other 4 Japanese women beside her. Bare heads, sunburned noses, the faint ink of their PW numbers at the edges of their collars. They exchanged a look that was part challenge, part fear. Prisoners did not ride bicycles, not in any story she had been told. She pushed off, the pedals biting under her bare feet, and the first breath of moving air rushed against her face, cool and dry and laced with dust. For a brief, disorienting second, the fence fell away. There was only the rattle of the chain, the scrape of tires over hardpan, and the endless, shimmering desert. If stories like this speak to you, you're welcome to subscribe and tell me which country you're listening from. 6 weeks earlier, a War Department internment camp outside Phoenix, Arizona, August 30th, 1945. 0930 hours. Intake shed, War Department internment camp outside Phoenix. The first thing Yumi noticed was the dust. It coated the floorboards of the intake building in a pale film, tracked in on heavy American boots, softening the sharp edges of the planks. Every time someone shifted, it lifted in faint ghosts around their ankles. "Next, PWJ," the corporal at the table called, his pencil already poised over a form. Yumi stepped forward when the Nisei interpreter nodded at her. The air inside the shed was cooler than outside, but still thick, smelling of sweat, printer's ink, and the sharp antiseptic from the adjoining examination room. Overhead, a ceiling fan clicked in lazy circles, moving more noise than air. She handed over the tag she had worn since leaving the transit camp in Hawaii. The corporal glanced at it, lips moving around, the unfamiliar syllables of her name, then wrote Nakamura Yumi in block letters on the form. On a second line, he printed a number, PWJ 4127. The number was larger than her name. "Hold out your right hand," the interpreter translated. She extended it, palm down. The medic gripped her wrist and rolled each inked finger onto a card with practiced indifference. The cold blackness clung to the whorls of her skin. She kept her eyes on the table's scarred surface, where someone had carved initials years before this war. Through the open doorway, she could see a slice of the camp. Long rows of low barracks, their tar paper roofs shimmering, and beyond them, nothing but desert, flat, beige, then rising into the blue shadow of distant mountains. "Height? Weight," the corporal muttered. The medic's tape slid around her chest, her hips, as if measuring a bundle of cloth instead of a person. Someone at the far end of the room coughed. Another prisoner sneezed, a high, startled sound. "Can you read English?" the interpreter asked suddenly in Japanese. Yumi hesitated. On the table, a A stack of forms rustled softly in the fan's weak breeze. She thought of school in Yokohama, of cramped desks and chalk dust, of a teacher tracing out foreign letters on a cracked slate. "A little," she answered. The interpreter passed this on. The corporal looked up for the first time, his eyes a faded gray under the brim of his cap. He made a mark in a margin she couldn't see. "Noted," he said. They took her temperature, listened to her heartbeat through a cold stethoscope, and checked her arms for scars. The medic's rubber gloves squeaked faintly against her skin. At the end, they handed her a bundle: denim trousers, a jacket with PW stenciled in black on the back, canvas shoes. In a corner stood an American MP, arms crossed, pistol at his hip. He watched the line without expression, as if all of this, the ink, the numbers, the women in their worn civilian clothes, were just another chore between breakfast and lunch. When Yumi stepped back out into the blinding light, hugging the bundle, the dust rose to meet her again, erasing her footsteps almost as soon as she made them. They marched, the five of them, to the women's compound just before noon. The guard walked ahead, rifle slung, boots thumping in the dust. Behind him, Yumi and the others moved in single file, each carrying a gray army blanket and a metal mess tin. Their civilian clothes had been traded for identical denim. Only the way they held themselves gave away differences of age and habit. The women's barracks was smaller than the ones she had seen from the intake shed, a single low building inside a secondary fence of fresh wire. A wooden sign on the corner post read, in black stenciled letters, "No unauthorized PW personnel beyond this point. Female PW area." Inside, 12 iron bunks waited, 3 rows of 4, thin mattresses smelling of soap and old canvas. A bare bulb hung from the ceiling, unlit in the hard daylight. Someone had nailed a scrap of newspaper over a knothole in the wall. American faces stared out from the faded print. "Choose a bunk," the Nisei interpreter said. "You will keep this place orderly. Lights out at 2100. The oldest woman, hair threaded with gray, immediately claimed a lower bunk near the door. Another, with sharp eyes and a factory callus along her palm, dropped her blanket on the upper bunk above Yumi without a word. The youngest hovered uncertainly, fingers pinching the fabric of her trouser leg. From outside came the sudden rumble of an engine, then shouted German. Yumi crossed to the small window. Between the strands of inner fence she saw them, a line of German POWs in work shirts and floppy hats, tools over their shoulders, heading toward the fields. One grinned and lifted 2 fingers in a jaunty salute toward the barracks. "Hey, Fräulein," he called. He didn't finish. The American MP at the corner tower snapped something harsh, the sound cutting across the yard like a whip crack. The German dropped his hand, eyes dropping to the dust. The line moved on, boots scuffing. Yumi felt heat rise to her face, and anger without clear direction. She was not a girl to be shielded like porcelain, yet some smaller, quieter part of her unclenched at the sharpness of the guard's voice, at the distance enforced by wire and orders. By late afternoon, the women had stowed their few belongings, argued briefly over the best way to fold blankets, and fallen into a wary silence. Outside, a whistle blew. Men shouted. A truck backfired. After evening roll call, there was a knock on the barracks door. The MP opened it just enough to admit a slim man in khaki with Asian features and an insignia she didn't recognize. He carried a clipboard. "I am Technical Sergeant Tanaka," he said in careful Japanese. "Interpreter." His gaze passed over the 5 women, pausing on Yumi. "I have some questions about your work before the war." The next time Yumi saw Technical Sergeant Tanaka, he was standing beside a different table. This one sat in a low administrative building near the camp gate. The room smelled of dust, carbon paper, and the faint tang of coffee. 2 typewriters clacked in uneven rhythm at the far end, operated by women in civilian dresses. A wall clock ticked over their heads, its second hand jerking forward like a nervous habit. "Sit, please," Tanaka said in Japanese, pulling out a chair. Across from her, a stocky staff sergeant in khaki studied a thin folder with her number on the tab. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, revealing tanned forearms dusted with dried sweat. On his chest, his name tape read Lewis. "She worked as a clerk," Tanaka translated, "and some English reading." Lewis grunted. "We're setting up a light-duty work." Detail. "Within regulations. Might look good next time the Red Cross pokes its nose in." Tanaka's mouth tightened slightly as he passed this along. The phrase lost some of its edge in Japanese, but not all. "What kind of work?" Yumi asked. Lewis flipped a page. "Repair, cleaning, civilian equipment. Nothing sensitive." Outside the open window came a metallic clatter, then a hollow rattle, like bones in a tin. Yumi turned her head. Through the glass, across a strip of hard-packed dirt, she caught a glimpse of a handcart piled with bicycle frames. Rusted, wheelless, their handlebars turned at awkward angles. Loose wheels leaned against the side of a long building she recognized as a former mess hall, its kitchen chimney bricked up. For a moment, the cart blurred into an alley in Yokohama, a boy pedaling hard, school satchel bouncing, the bell on his handlebars chiming as he swerved past crates of fish. "Work will be under guard," Tanaka said, "inside the camp. You will receive extra soap rations if your performance is satisfactory." "If I refuse?" The question slipped out before she could smooth it. Tanaka hesitated. "Refusal will be noted. It may affect future decisions." The clock on the wall ticked. Somewhere nearby, a tool rang against concrete. Yumi looked down at her hands, the faint traces of fingerprint ink still lodged in the lines of her skin, and thought of the empty hours in the barracks, the stale air, the way silence grew heavy as another blanket. Lewis slid a single sheet across the table. Her number and name were already typed at the top. Below, in English, were lines she could not fully read. "Sign here," he said. "If you're willing," Tanaka translated, though she no longer needed the words. Her fingers closed around the stubby pencil. For a heartbeat, she saw the bicycle frames again, skeletal against the desert light. Delivery boys, streets that might now be ash. She wrote Nakamura Yumi in careful characters on the line. When she finished, the pencil left a small smear of graphite on her fingertip, dark against the ink stains. "Report to the repair shed. Due 800 hours tomorrow," Tanaka said. Outside, the cart of bicycles jolted forward, vanishing behind the mess hall as if the camp itself had swallowed it. The repair shed had once been a mess hall. Yumi could tell from the row of high windows and the faint ghost of cooking smoke in the ceiling beams. Now the long room smelled of rubber, oil, and solvent. At one end, bicycle frames leaned in a restless herd against the wall, their paint chipped and flaking. Wheels lay stacked like coins, some with spokes missing, others sagging on limp, flat tires. A workbench ran the length of the opposite wall, scarred by years of trays and now cluttered with tools. "Over here, Nakamura," Sergeant Lewis called. She joined 3 of the other women at a cleared section of bench. "Yeah." Front of each lay an inner tube, a small tin of vulcanizing cement, a handful of round patches, and a scuffed metal hand pump. The tube on her station sagged like a dead snake. Lewis held up a card with her number on it. "Work card," Tanaka translated. "They mark hours. Good record means maybe small privileges. Canteen, extra soap." He hung the card on a nail above her head and pointed to a bucket of water on the floor. "First, find the leak." Yumi knelt, lowering the tube into the bucket. The water cooled her fingers. She rolled the rubber slowly until a thin string of bubbles rose from a pinhole near a seam. The sight was oddly satisfying. Lewis handed her a bit of chalk. "Mark it. Dry it. then scrape. She followed his gestures more than his words. Chalk circle. Pat dry. The rasping tool in her hand made a soft, gritty sound as she roughened the rubber. The solvent reeked, sharp and chemical, catching in her throat. She pressed the patch down, fingers trembling, then waited while the cement set. The seconds stretched by the ticking of a distant wall clock. Now pump. The hand pump was heavier than it looked. She pressed the handle down, feeling resistance grow as air filled the tube. The hose warmed under her palm. When she dipped the patched section back into the bucket, the water lay still. No bubbles. Lewis leaned over her shoulder, his shadow falling across the surface. "Good," he said, more to himself than to her. "See? Not so hard." Tanaka relayed the words, but she had already understood the tone. A small knot in her chest loosened. As she coiled the revived tube on the bench, she noticed a crate near the door, stenciled with English she could partially decode. Church drive, children's bicycles. "For kids," Lewis said, following her gaze. "Poor families, GIs coming home." Tanaka's translation landed like a stone in still water. Poor American children. Bicycles. Her hands, on this side of the wire, making something for them. Yumi reached for the next flaccid tube. The pump's handle fit more easily in her grip this time, but the air in the shed felt heavier. Mrs. Martinez arrived in the late morning, when the heat had settled into the shed like an extra layer of clothing. Yumi noticed her first by the shoes, scuffed pumps instead of boots, dust powdering the leather. Then the hem of a simple cotton dress, faded flowers at the edge. The woman stepped carefully around a stack of wheels, clutching a clipboard to her chest. Lewis straightened. "This is Mrs. Martinez. She's from the church group." Tanaka echoed the words in Japanese. Mrs. Martinez smiled in the direction of the women, not quite meeting their eyes, then turned back to the bicycles. Her hair was pinned up hastily, a few strands escaping in the humidity. A light, powdery scent followed her. Floral, cheap, startling against the sour tang of rubber and oil. She flipped the metal tongue of her clipboard and read from the top sheet. "Tommy Gutierrez, age 9, needs a 20-inch frame." Her English rolled with a soft border town rhythm. Lewis pointed to a smaller, mud-splattered frame. "That one, maybe." "Betty Lou Carter, 8, Mrs. Martinez continued. "Her papa comes home from Europe next month." The names slid past Yumi like pebbles in a stream. She caught fragments as Tanaka murmured translations. 9 years old, father overseas, farm outside town. Children waiting, counting days against mail that might not come. In her mind, other children crowded. Cousins in Yokohama, faces smudged with soot, clutching rice bowls too light in their hands. No one was refurbishing bicycles for them. Mrs. Martinez moved closer to the bench where Yumi worked, checking the width of handlebars with a practiced eye. Up close, Yumi saw the faint line where a ring had once sat on the woman's finger, the skin there paler. "She did these tubes?" Mrs. Martinez asked, nodding at the tidy coil stacked by Yumi's station. Lewis grunted. "Yeah, neatest of the bunch." Through Tanaka, Mrs. Martinez said, "Thank you. The children will be very happy." The words landed awkwardly in Japanese, formal and thin. But Mrs. Martinez's expression, a quick, earnest dip of the head, filled in the spaces between them. Yumi felt an impulse to look away, to retreat behind the safety of the PW letters on her back. Instead, her gaze caught on the clipboard again, on the list of names marching down the page. She reached for another deflated tube, fingers slick with cement. The rubber stuck briefly to her palm before yielding, as if it, too, were uncertain which world it belonged to. The first sign of trouble was the clicking. Yumi was sorting through a pile of warped rims when it came, a sharp, mechanical snap, too precise to be a tool. She looked up. Through the open doorway, sunlight flashed off metal. Then again, a camera. Large, boxy, the kind she had seen only in magazines before the war. Lewis swore under his breath. "Damn it, they're early." Tanaka moved toward the entrance. "Stay at your stations," he told the women. His voice was calm, but his shoulders had gone rigid. Outside the workshop, beside the perimeter fence, stood a knot of civilians. Their clothes were Sunday neat, pressed shirts, cotton dresses, but their faces were tight. A woman at the front held a folded gold star service flag against her stomach, the fabric trembling in the breeze. A camp officer gestured toward the shed as the photographer crouched, adjusting the bellows of his camera. The shutter snapped again. Yumi instinctively stepped back, bumping into the bench. A rim clattered to the floor. "Keep working," Lewis ordered, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the fence. The photographer shifted position, aiming through the wire. The civilians peered in. One man spat into the dust. The woman with the gold star flag stared directly at Yumi, not at the bicycles, not at the guard, but at her. Then the woman's voice cut across the yard, clear and hard. "My boy died on Okinawa," she said, "and they get to play mechanic." The words hit Yumi like cold water. She felt them lodge beneath her ribs. Okinawa, a name she knew only through Japanese broadcasts, wrapped in triumphal lies. She opened her mouth, though she had nothing to say. Shame and something like indignation tangled in her throat. Lewis barked, "Move back!" at the photographer. The guard by the gate slammed it shut, the metal rasping against the frame. Mrs. Martinez, arriving late with her clipboard, froze just inside the shed. Her eyes darted from the bicycles to the civilians, then to Yumi. For a heartbeat, pity and helplessness flickered across her face. The camera snapped again. Tanaka stepped between the women and the fence, trying to block the shot, his expression tight with frustration. "Enough photos," he called in English. "They are workers, nothing more." But the civilians were already drifting away, their murmurs rising like smoke. The Gold Star mother folded her flag with deliberate care, as if sealing something final. When the photographer finally left, Lewis shut the shed door with more force than needed. Dust shivered from the frame. "Back to work," he said, but no one reached for tools right away. That evening, as the sun bled across the desert, word spread through the compound. The bicycle program was under review. Work might stop. Privileges might be cut. In the women's barracks, Yumi sat on her bunk, hands still smelling faintly of vulcanizing cement. The echo of the woman's voice clung to her. "My boy died on Okinawa," louder than any hammer strike in the workshop. For 3 days, the shed stayed locked. The women still marched past it every morning on their way to roll call. The bicycles waited inside, glimpsed only through high windows, frames frozen mid-repair, a wheel hanging from the rafters like a stopped clock. The absence of work settled over the women's compound like an extra blanket, heavy and stifling. Yumi spent the first morning scrubbing the barracks floor with a stiff brush, the second mending a frayed seam in her jacket. By the third, her fingers itched for the familiar weight of the hand pump. Instead, she sat on her bunk, listening. From somewhere near the camp headquarters came the muted rise and fall of voices. Once, the chaplain's low baritone carried clearly through the open barracks window as he crossed the yard, Bible under one arm, cap tucked under the other. Later, a jeep door slammed, and an engine revved away toward the main gate. "Maybe the church is angry," the eldest woman murmured. "Maybe they do not want enemy hands touching their gifts." "Maybe Americans do not agree with each other," another said, her tone half hope, half warning. In the afternoon, Red Cross talk drifted through in fragments. A guard mentioned inspections, reputation, treatment of PW. The words meant little alone, but together they sketched an invisible battle being fought over their labor. On the fourth morning, the lock on the shed was gone. Lewis waited by the door, cap pushed back, expression unreadable. The women lined up, uncertainty making their movements stiff. Behind him, the bicycles stood exactly where they had left them, except for a thin layer of dust on exposed metal. "The program continues," Tanaka announced. "No more photographs. The bicycles will leave by truck. No publicity." Lewis added something in English, eyes on Yumi. "If everything goes smooth from here on out," he said, "there might be a little reward when we're done." Tanaka translated with a small shrug. Yumi stepped back into the familiar smell of rubber and oil. The shed felt different now, as if another layer had been peeled back. Not one America, she thought, but several, arguing over what to do with a handful of women and a pile of broken bicycles. She picked up a tube, pressed it gently between her fingers, and waited for the faint hiss of air to tell her where to begin. The rhythm returned. In the days after the shed reopened, the work settled into a pattern. Mornings for tubes and tires, afternoons for chains and bearings. Yumi's hands moved with growing certainty, fingers finding leaks almost before the bubbles rose in the water, palm learning exactly how much pressure the pump handle needed. On this afternoon, the air felt thicker than usual, heavy with the metallic sweetness of chain oil. A row of frames stood lined up like skeletons at inspection, their chains dangling loose. "Today we clean and oil," Lewis said. Tanaka repeated it, though the demonstration spoke for itself. The sergeant dipped a rag into the tin, then drew it along the links with slow, practiced strokes. The chain darkened, gleaming in the light. Yumi mimicked the movement, the rag warm and slick in her fingers. Each link clicked softly as it passed around the rear sprocket. Behind her, the eldest woman began to talk, voice low. At first, Yumi thought she was muttering a prayer. Then the words sharpened into a story. Of a night in Nagoya, sirens wailing, the sky pulsing red, the sound of bombs like giants slamming doors in the clouds. Lewis's hand paused mid-stroke. He didn't understand the words, but the tone needed no translation. Tanaka listened, jaw tight, before offering a brief summary in English. "Her neighborhood burned," he said. "Most of it." Lewis grunted, eyes dropping to his work. "We had drills," he said after a moment. "Back home. Blackouts. Kids hiding under desks like that could stop anything." He chuckled once, without humor. "Didn't feel untouched from where we were sitting either. Rubber rationed, tires bald as a baby's backside." The image snagged in Yumi's mind. American children ducking under desks, lights switched off, mothers counting heartbeats in the dark. The chain slipped in her grip. A small washer clinked onto the floor and rolled away. Before she could stop herself, the question pushed out, rough and clumsy through Tanaka. "Were your children afraid of the bombs too?" Lewis blinked. For a moment, the only sound was the faint creak of the building settling. "My girl was born in 44, he said finally. "Too young to know what we were practicing for. But the neighbor's boy, yeah, he'd cry when the siren tests started." Tanaka's Japanese carried the hesitation, the admission. Yumi looked down at the chain in her hands. Oil glistened along each link, catching the light, binding metal to metal. The world she had imagined, their sky untouched, their children unafraid, shifted, the lines smudging. Later, as they stacked finished wheels, Tanaka lingered by her bench. "They are talking about ships," he murmured softly in Japanese. "Repatriation. Your name is on an early list." The knowledge settled in her chest beside the sergeant's words, as heavy and undeniable as the tin of chain oil. The first finished bicycle looked almost new. Freshly oiled chain, straightened rims, a patched leather saddle rubbed soft with grease. The blue paint on the frame was chipped along the top tube, but in the slanting afternoon light, the flaws softened, turning the metal into a clean, solid line. Lewis wheeled it to the center of the shed, one hand on the seat, the other on the handlebars. The rear wheel clicked faintly as the free wheel spun. "Regulation says no PW operates vehicles," he said, nodding toward the rule board nailed by the door. The English letters were stark and tall. Yumi recognized only a few, but Tanaka had translated the list often enough. No weapons, no vehicles, no contact with civilians. Lewis hooked a thumb into his belt. Good thing this isn't going anywhere. Yet. The women watched from their benches, rags still in hand. The room hummed with unspent motion. Yumi's gaze followed the curve of the handlebars, the familiar sweep of the frame. In her legs, a memory stirred. The burn in her thighs as she climbed a hill in Yokohama, wind tugging at her skirt, her brother shouting from behind to go faster. Lewis caught her look. "You know how to ride, don't you?" he asked. Tanaka translated. Heat crept up her neck. "A little," she said. Lewis hesitated, glancing toward the closed door, then at the small, high windows. No shadows passed there. The yard outside was quiet. "Come here," he said. Tanaka almost protested, then swallowed it. She stepped forward. Up close, the bicycle towered higher than the ones from home. Lewis kept a firm grip on the seat as she swung one leg over the frame. The saddle felt foreign under her. The pedals rested under her bare feet, cool and smooth. "Just a few feet," he murmured. "I've got you." He pushed. The bicycle rolled, slow and wobbly, the concrete floor humming beneath the tires. Instinct tugged her shoulders into balance. For 3, 4 seconds, the world narrowed to the small circle of light on the floor and the soft clatter of the chain. Then they stopped. Her heart beat faster than the short distance deserved. Lewis eased the bicycle back onto its stand. "Not bad," he said. "Maybe, when we're all done here, we'll let you ladies take a proper spin. Out in the yard." Tanaka relayed the words. The other women murmured, half skeptical, half eager. Yumi stepped down, legs oddly light. The brief glide still tingled in her muscles. It scared her, how much she wanted the promised lap, how the idea of circling the dusty yard on 2 wheels suddenly seemed as vast as the desert beyond the wire. October 19th, 1945, 14:30 hours, the yard shimmered. The bicycles stood in a ragged line near the shed door, their frames casting thin shadows on the hard-packed dirt. Beyond them, the inner fence ran in a straight, uncompromising rectangle, watchtowers planted at the corners like punctuation marks. "Okay, ladies." Sergeant Lewis shaded his eyes with one hand, the other resting on his holster. "One lap. Stay inside the yard, no tricks." Tanaka translated, though the women were already moving toward the bikes. The words had become familiar since that first time he'd said them, an odd little script they all understood now. The MP at the gate watched, expression flat, shotgun cradled in the crook of his arm. Yumi's hands found the same blue frame she had ridden inside the shed. The saddle creaked as she swung her leg over. For a second, she hovered, foot on the ground, acutely aware of everything, the dry heat on the back of her neck, the grit under her toes, the faint smell of chain oil rising from the moving parts. "Go on," Lewis said quietly. "You've earned it." She pushed off. The first turns of the pedals were uncertain, the bicycle wobbling as if remembering her weight. Then balance slid into place, as clean as a patched tube sealing underwater. The yard opened in a wide loop ahead. Dust rose in low amber clouds under the tires. Wind, real wind, not just the breathless stir of the ceiling fan, pressed against her face. It tasted of sand and something metallic from the wire, dry and oddly clean. The fence blurred at the edges of her vision, becoming lines rather than bars. Around her, the other women circled, some laughing, some grimly focused. Their denim jackets flashed the black letters PW with each rise and fall of their shoulders. From the tower, a guard silhouette turned to track them, rifle a dark line against the sky. For a fleeting moment, the distance between her and the unseen children waiting for these bicycles shrank to the width of the top tube under her hands. When Lewis finally signaled, she coasted to a stop, breath quick, legs tingling. As she swung down, engines rumbled at the far side of the yard. A truck backed up to the shed, tailgate clanging open. "Load them up," a voice called. Tanaka approached, a folded paper in his hand, face serious. "Nakamura Yumi," he said. "Report to administration after this. They have news about your return." The yard seemed to tilt slightly. Yumi glanced once at the blue bicycle as it was lifted onto the truck, then at the gate that would soon open for her in a different way. The wind on her skin was already turning into memory. The administration building felt smaller than Yumi remembered, as if the walls had crept inward. She sat in a straight-backed chair opposite a metal desk, its surface crowded with stacks of forms, a half-empty inkwell, and a blotter stained in overlapping circles. The overhead fan ticked, stirring the smell of dust and carbon paper. On the wall behind the officer's head hung a map of the Pacific. Thin colored lines traced shipping routes, arcing from San Francisco and Seattle toward dots labeled Yokohama, Kobe, Kure. Some of the dots were circled in red pencil. Others crossed through with a single decisive stroke. "Port's damaged," Tanaka murmured in Japanese, following her gaze. "Not all are ready to receive ships yet." The captain at the desk, spectacles, neat mustache, lines of fatigue at his mouth, flipped through a file. "PWJ 4127, he said. "Nakamura Yumi. Tentative assignment. Transport from West Coast within the next 2 months. Port to be determined." Tanaka translated, then added quietly, "It means you will likely go through a camp near the ocean first, then by ship." "And if I say I do not want to go?" Yumi asked. Both men blinked. The captain set his pen down. "You want to remain in U.S. custody?" he said slowly, as if testing the shape of the idea. "There is another option." He opened a different folder, thinner, its papers crisp. "We are assembling witnesses for certain proceedings," he continued. "War crimes, treatment of prisoners, civilian casualties. Some PW will stay longer to testify." Tanaka's translation felt heavier than usual. "If you served in Saipan, your testimony might be of interest," the captain said. "It would delay your repatriation, perhaps by months, longer." Images rose unbidden. The cliff edges of Saipan, bodies in the surf, voices shrill with slogans about honorable death. The idea of standing in a room and speaking of those things to rows of foreign faces made her stomach knot. "I wish to go home," she said. "Home may not look like you remember," Tanaka warned softly. "I know," Yumi replied. It was only partly true. The captain nodded, marking something in her file with a quick, final stroke. One column filled, another left blank. Outside, in the corridor, other prisoners waited on benches, documents in hand. Names were called, decisions made, each one another thread in the tangled web of what came after defeat. That night, back in the women's barracks, Yumi borrowed a stub of pencil and a scrap torn from the edge of an old camp notice. Under the dim bulb, she wrote the English words she had kept in her mouth like stones: water, soap, desert, fence, bicycle. She folded the scrap until it was no larger than her thumb and slipped it into the hem of her jacket. A small, fragile proof that she had lived, for a time, on the far side of the map on the captain's wall. They woke before dawn to the sound of engines. Headlamps washed the compound in pale cones of light as the trucks lined up outside the inner fence, tailgates down, wooden benches bolted along the sides. The air was cool enough that Yumi could see her breath for a few seconds before it vanished into the gray. "Bring your blanket and issued items only," the guard called. "No souvenirs." In the barracks, the 5 women moved in a quiet, efficient dance. Blankets folded, tin cups rattled into kit bags. Yumi slid a finger along the hem of her jacket, feeling for the small, stiff lump of the paper scrap. The stitches held. They formed a line by the door. Tanaka checked off names on a clipboard, eyes lingering on each face a heartbeat longer than necessary. Port of embarkation on the coast, he said. From there, ship to Japan. You will receive further instructions along the way. Outside, the barbed wire gates were swung open for the first time in her presence. MPs flanked the gap, rifles slung, the metal of their badges catching the early light. Beyond, the desert stretched pale and flat, edged by the dark silhouettes of distant hills. As Yumi climbed onto the truck, the boards cold under her palms, she turned her head instinctively toward the road skirting the camp. A small figure moved there, a boy on a bicycle, pedaling hard to keep pace with the convoy. The frame was blue, chipped along the top tube. Even from a distance, she recognized the line of it, the way the handlebars kicked slightly to one side. For a moment, he rode parallel to the open gate, separated from her by only wire and air. Dust streamed from his tires, catching the first gold of the sun. He lifted one hand from the handlebar in an unsteady wave, more to the morning than to the prisoners. The truck jolted forward. The boy fell behind, then vanished in the mirror's small rectangle. Yumi settled onto the bench, fingers curling around the edge of the seat as the camp slid away. Engines grumbled, wood rattled, and the fences that had framed her days shrank into thin, silver lines. In her mind, the hand pump worked up and down, a patch pressed firm over a puncture. Chain oil gleamed on metal. Movements of repair, learned in a place of confinement, carrying her now toward a country she no longer fully knew. The desert wind seeped through the slats and brushed her face, dry and familiar. She closed her eyes, and, for a heartbeat, it felt like riding.